Hey everybody, and welcome back to another MyJS story. This week we're talking to Rebecca Turner from NPM. Do you want to say hi?
Hi.
All right. Well, I sent you the questions ahead of time, so we're just gonna get rolling. But we had you on, I'm trying to remember, it was like 2 or 3 years ago.
2 years ago, I think. Yeah. Back when NPM 3 was not out yet, I think.
Yeah. We also had a few other people from NPM on. Forrest, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Episode 174. Man, my Google skills are just that fast. Yeah, we talked about NPM 3. Lots of great stuff there. And we'll probably dig into that a little bit of, what's it like working for NPM and what you're working on these days. But let's start at the very beginning. When did you get started programming?
So I got started programming when I was 12, and my handwriting was very slow, to the point where it was impacting my English classes. I was essentially drawing my letters instead of actually writing them. And my parents noticed this, and so they enrolled me in a typing class. And then the summer that I was learning to type, they borrowed an Apple II, and my dad sat down with me with an Apple Basic book and went through it with me. And that was it was kind of like fait accompli at that point. I was sold on programming, and so I went on to PC Basic and Pascal and Assembler and C and all that good stuff from the early days.
Back in the early days, I remember
back before the web.
Yeah, I was 13 or 14 when I had a TI-85 calculator that I was had Basic on it, and then we did Pascal in one of my math classes. But yeah, I never took programming seriously till I was much older. So it's kind of funny that I've talked to all these people, and they're like, "Yeah, I got started when I was 12, and I was just kind of hooked ever since."
I mean, I spent my I was certain that there was no way I would make it a career. I was like, I can't imagine having to push through those roadblocks when you're having a creative roadblock, and it's like, that sounds miserable. I couldn't do that as a job, and clearly I'm going to do something else. But it ended up being the path of least resistance. By the time I was out of high school, I managed to get a internship at a local software consulting company, and so then that's what actually kickstarted my career.
Gotcha. Hey there, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about Freelance Remote Conf. I'm putting on a conference for people who want to go freelance or who are freelance, and bringing in some of the experts from the Freelancer Show to talk to you about how to find clients, how to collect money, how to build your business, how to specialize, and much, much more. So if you're thinking about going freelance, or you're already freelance and want to hear from the experts on how to go, become, or grow your freelancing business, then by all means, come check us out at freelanceremoteconf.com.
That's what actually kickstarted my career.
Gotcha. So was your career initially in JavaScript, or did you kind of come to that through other channels?
Yeah. So when my first job was was writing DOS applications. In a language called Clipper, which nobody has heard of anymore. It was based on something called DBase, which more people have heard of. It was a DOS database programming environment. We were making information systems for chemical dependency clinics. And that company was eventually sold to the Betty Ford Center, actually. Huh. And then they said, "Would you like to move to Palm Desert?" And I'm like, no, I don't want to move to Palm Desert. I was living in Maine at the time, so that was kind of there was a bit of a culture clash there between Palm Springs and central Maine. So it was actually after that. I took a year off after that job and taught myself web programming things, so JavaScript, HTML, CGI, Perl, and got a job at an ISP after that. And so that's when I first started doing actual web stuff.
Really interesting. So you got into web, and was this back in the good old days before jQuery, or? Oh
yeah, this would have been like 97. So, we were essentially having to JavaScript was, the potential was there. We had Netscape 4, which had introduced layers, and it was like so close to being right, and then no one else is implementing it. This is terrible. You can actually manipulate things that aren't form fields or images, but it was still, that was all still super primitive. So I was doing mostly Perl programming at that point.
Oh, wow.
The back end for websites.
Yeah, I remember doing, when I got in, because I got into web development full-time about 2004, 2005. And so jQuery was kind of new, and we were doing Scriptaculous and Prototype and Pain. We did a lot of Pain.js and Hurt.js. Things have come a long way since then. They
really have. I mean, yeah, in the late 90s, it seemed like everyone was writing their own templating libraries. And to some degree, that hasn't really changed. But it's less central.
Yep. So you kind of got into this web thing. You were writing Perl. And then you had to do what? Do JavaScript on the front end, just kind of.
I mean, of course, back then everyone was full stack. It was the only mode of development. We had graphic designers who worked for us, and they were used to doing magazine layouts. So they didn't know anything about HTML, or they were like, "Well, here's a Photoshop file," and that they just wanted no further involvement at that point.
Oh wow!
And we're just starting at the first ISP I worked for, there was just starting to get that, we ended up actually hiring front end developers there for the first time, of people who were doing the HTML but weren't comfortable with JavaScript yet. So we still had to so I was doing that part for them.
Right.
And trying to put together environments that let us build websites quickly that could integrate these workflows. And of course, that's a super awkward place to integrate a workflow. Oh, well, I have this static page and I need you to make it do things, but I want to be able to come back and change the layout later. And CSS is pretty primitive. Yeah. I do not have nostalgia for those times.
I do not blame you. It's just interesting to kind of dig into this and say, at least to people who are coming in from a place where they're newish, anytime within the last 10 years, and have them realize, what, we've come a long way. I mean, all the things that we complain about now, it's in a lot of ways, it's nothing compared to what we had to do before. But I mean, that's the way of technology, right?
Right.
They used to have to pull the seeds out of the cotton that they picked by hand, and then Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and all of a sudden, that became a whole lot easier, and we were able to have people do more interesting, more powerful stuff. And it's the way things always go.
For sure. I mean, you do occasionally see people trying to valorize the past as well, it was simpler then. You could just, it was easier to learn. And it's it really wasn't, because you had to do so much more just to do anything. Simple things took so much longer back then. You look at all the interactivity on a modern web app, and you could do that in 2002, but basically the only people doing it were Google.
Yeah.
You had Gmail just launching sometime around there, and it was so much better in Google Maps, and they were so much better than anything anyone else was doing. And so it was that was the promise, but no one else was there.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that it really, in a lot of ways, comes down to what we understand. And so, as we push into the future and we get new technologies that do different things, do new things, expose new ideas and expose new ways of measuring and looking, we have the privacy debates these days and stuff. And it's not because we don't understand the issues. In a lot of ways, it's just that the technology is so new that we don't understand all of the implications of what we're doing. So... yeah, was it a simpler time? Well, in some ways, because if we had moved ahead from there, we would have understood very well what we had. But the fact of the matter is we're moving ahead so quickly now that it's very hard to understand what all the impacts are until we've long moved past something.
It's true.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I gave a talk at Open Source and Feelings last year, which was essentially specifically on the whole thing of like, here's some old technology, and that I mean, it came out of having heard someone talk about the whole thing of it used to be better, and I'm like, I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of older technology that's now looked down on that was really solving problems for us back then.
Right.
And I wouldn't use it today necessarily, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have its place in history. And so the talk ended up being basically about what were the use cases that things that are no longer have that cachet. What were those use cases back when they were new? Why were we excited when those came out? You know, why is MySQL the most common database used in web dev? Like, when clearly Postgres is a better database. There's some good reasons for that, right?
Yep.
And most of those have to do with how it was being distributed when it first came out versus how Postgres was distributed. Postgres was a pain in the ass to set up. Still kind of is, but it's not, it's easy enough now that you don't really have that excuse anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And Open Source and Feelings, I've never actually been, but Carrie Miller's a friend of mine, and it just seems like a great conference to.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
I'd
Can't
put a
say
plug
enough
in
good
for
things
that.
about it.
Yeah. So the thing that we had you on for was to talk about NPM. Do you still work for NPM Inc.?
I do. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what that's like? Because, and then I'll just preface this by saying that I had Isaac Schluter on earlier, and we talked about kind of the journey through NPM, but I don't know if people really understand like what it's like to be part of this company that works on something that's so core to a community. And in particular, Isaac's kind of he's the CEO, but he's also kind of the face of the project.
Right.
But the rest of you all really contribute a lot to what we use. So I'm curious, like, what is it like to be in there, and how did you get involved in the way that you are?
I mean, yeah, Isaac's primary contribution at this point is TAP and NYC, and still mostly TAP as far as that's concerned.
What do you mean by TAP?
He has a test library.
Oh, okay.
Called NodeTap, and it implements the Test Anywhere protocol, which is the testing framework that Perl originally developed, and so that's what like all of NPM's tests are written in.
Oh, okay.
So that's like his hobby project at this point. He doesn't do a lot of code anymore, just because turns out being a CEO is in fact a job.
No way.
And yeah, I know. It turns out they have to do stuff. They're not just like sitting in their office and counting money. Or, as a startup counting bills. But I mean, to some degree, working at NPM is like working at any other company.
Right.
We're just a company. But at another level, like as far as the actual work that we do, particularly because I work on the command line tool, which is directly, it's like you work on the website. It's a lot like working on any very popular website that a lot of people are going to be impacted by. Working on the command line tool is we're essentially shipping packaged software, right? And that's a weird place to be in 2017. And so we spend a substantial amount of our time on interacting with the community. So we have one of the most active issue trackers on GitHub. I think we came in at number 5 when they released those stats.
Oh, wow.
Which was kind of terrifying, but also validating because it felt like it was that busy.
You're well loved. We'll just, yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are using it. And so there are a lot of, and that's where we tell everyone to go for support. That's the other thing. That's probably the biggest reason that we get so much traffic there. We have a support team now, but people are still told, go to the issue tracker, file an issue. So we got a lot of things like, proxy issues, and proxy issues are probably the single most common problem that people have. Yeah. Just because they're, they just tried it and it didn't work from their perspective.
Yeah.
And we look at it and go, yeah, that's because you're behind some weird corporate proxy and we don't auto configure from like your Windows config. It'd be awfully nice to do that kind of thing, but there are a lot of fiddly details there. And no one's ever like sat down and worked that out. And a lot of them are in the registry.
Yeah. Oh,
But,
Windows. That takes me back. Anyway, so how did you get started at NPM?
Well, I mean, it was 2 years ago, and they had a job ad out, which was, we need a CLI developer. Mm-hmm. And basically everything about the position was, it sounded like exactly the sort of thing that I like to do. Writing software to support other software developers, paid open source work. And they had, Ridgerdale, Aria Stewart is a friend of mine, mm-hmm. and we were actually working together in Boston. They had previously tried to recruit her, and she was like, well, I just took a job at PayPal, but you should talk to my friend Rebecca. She would be totally up for this. But I actually just applied through the website in the normal way. And a month later, maybe it was two or 3 weeks later, they did their interviews, and that was it. It was in many ways very much like applying for any other job, except that NPM doesn't do tech screens, so that was definitely that felt very different.
They don't do tech screens?
No, we don't do tech screens when we interview.
So
on the basis that in our experience, tech screens don't really tell us anything.
Okay.
In that, we have all done tech screens on people and then had them turn out to not do well. And
yes.
And we've also, but of course, then you don't have the opposite answer of somebody who didn't do well in the tech screen. You probably didn't hire, but they might have done fine. And we decided we just weren't learning anything from doing that. So the interviews, the fact that I had a bunch of published open source made it, I think, a lot easier because they could go, hey, look at all this code that I wrote. At that point, I had a Gearman implementation. Gearman is a message bus. It's a protocol. It was developed by the LiveJournal people back when LiveJournal was a thing. And it has implementations in a dozen languages. And so I wrote a Node implementation of the client and server, and I actually wrote a server implementation. And so then that was my example of, look, I can do Node well.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So what are they looking for then? If they don't do a tech screen, are they just looking for personality and culture fit, or? Yeah.
So one of the advantages NPM has, of course, is that NPM has a embarrassment of riches whenever we put up a job ad. Mm-hmm. We never have a problem finding qualified people applying. It really is different when you're on the other end of that, where it's everyone applying, half the people applying haven't even used, you're primarily a JavaScript shop and half the people applying haven't used JavaScript. Mm-hmm. You're like, well, we can teach it to you. And that's totally a thing that we could do, but really rather not.
Yeah, I could tell stories about that. I'm hiring a new executive assistant, and I did phone screenings, and I screened out about 2/3 of the people I talked to. Yeah.
Yeah, we do a lot of filtering at the phone screen level.
Yeah.
So that when it comes time to do interviews, we're looking at maybe 8 people. And we're interviewing for culture fit, but we're very clear. We try to be very clear on what we mean by that, and what are the criteria that we're looking for a particular position. So when we've hired for the CLI, which actually we've only done once since I was there, and that's when we hired Kat Marchand.
Okay.
But we were very clear that the skill that we thought that was going to be hardest to find was somebody who would be able to interact with the community well. So all of our interview questions were centered around that, and being able to remain calm when people are mad at you, to be able to be constructive in the face of, because when things aren't working, people are unsurprisingly frustrated and not showing their best face.
Right.
And you can't ramp that up. If you ramp that up, we've all seen issue trackers where people do that.
Yep.
And it's not pretty. And it's just people being human at each other.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but the best case scenario is it's I'm frustrated. Well, I'm frustrated too. And the worst case scenario is then you have some major issue online.
Right. So that's what we were trying to interview for, and we were trying to assess when we were talking to our candidates. Mm-hmm. And we told them all this at the start of our interviews, that like we're not going to be asking you tricky tech questions. We're going to be asking you questions about how you interact with communities.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I also like the idea of, and this is what I've done with the executive assistant role as well, I was looking for somebody that I felt like I could work with, but I specified that into personality traits and skills, because otherwise I wind up hiring somebody that's like me, and that's not actually what I need. And so if I can nail it down to, they need to be self-driven and autonomous, because I don't want to babysit them. And they have these particular skills, or they seem to be able to pick up how to use WordPress and, the handful of other tools that I need. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. They're detail oriented and just stuff like that, rather than go off of, well, I just need an assistant. I just need somebody. Yeah.
I mean, the culture fit gets thrown around a lot. And if you don't specify it, then it just becomes whatever your unconscious biases are.
Yep.
If you specify it, it's actually a really important criteria.
Yeah, but the other thing is putting biases aside, if you know what you need, then you're going to hire what you need instead of...
Right.
Yeah, instead of the default, whatever your setup is pushing you toward. So your personal makeup is pushing you toward.
Right.
So what is it like day to day working on NPM? I mean, I'm assuming people have this grandiose idea, and then when I think about it, I'm like, they're probably coding just like me.
Yeah, pretty much. It's really not, so we have a 2-week release cycle, and that impacts these days, and that impacts our how our work goes.
Okay.
We have general, in an ideal world, we would just work on stuff, and whatever was ready when the release day came, that's what goes out in it.
Right.
And that's what we've always said we wanted. But in practice, you go, I'm planning to have this in the release, and then you really push to have it in the release. Mm-hmm. So the release week is spent with much more of a focus on that. So there's like picking out existing pull requests that are ready to land, making sure those get landed, and that's actually surprisingly time consuming, in part because like anything that's not ready to land, you have to be able to give sufficient feedback to people that they can go do it.
Right.
And checking back on all of the old ones, we have about 60 or 70 PRs that just outstanding at any given time. Most of which are missing tests or documentation or some other key piece. And it's like, well, that like I said, it sits at about that level. So new ones come in and old ones go out. It's kind of surprises me just how high that is, but at the same time, it's not been going up. So I'm pretty okay with that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the rest of the time, it's either you're working on a feature that we've decided as a team is a priority for the community, or we're working on a feature that's a priority for the business. Or we're fixing bugs, and that's entirely based on like a judgment call of how important is this? Is this important enough to block the feature work that we're working on?
So I'm wondering, is there a feature or a problem that you've solved that you're especially proud of?
So we've fixed a really esoteric int issue a month ago, and of course I brought that up, and then I'm like, and what was the details on that? I don't remember. Go look that up. It was sufficiently weird. Like that was one where this had been outstanding for us for months. Right. So this was specifically about sometimes people would get it was the cache mismatch one that was really on my mind. So the problem was this: users were occasionally getting SHA-SUM errors when downloading tarballs from the registry, which absolutely should not be possible. we download through a something called Write Stream Atomic, which flushes everything out to a temporary file name, and only when it's absolutely done with the download, then it renames it over atomically to replace the existing file. So there's no way that should be able to be incomplete. And this ended up being a problem in NPM registry client, which I'm bringing up the patch here. Yes. So they were getting these SHA-SUM errors, and what we finally noticed was that they only happened. People would get a failure, and then it would go to a retry, and on the retry they would get the SHA-SUM error. And the SHA-SUM error, like, it should never be writing a partial tarball share cache, and yet somehow it was. And and what it turned out was happening was the way the error handlers were set up in NPM registry client, and this was not a new thing. This had been set up this way for like 4 years. But it just, for whatever reason, timing issues, people were getting timeouts sometimes on their initial tarball fetch. And so most people never see those, but if you're like behind a proxy or a slow internet connection, then you see them more. Right. So it's like, well, the Chinese users see it a lot. And then we tell them to point them at, CNPM, and they're fine, because that's a registry mirror that exists behind the firewall.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, we don't run it. It's run by some organization in China. But yeah, they maintain their own registry mirror behind the firewall and mirror out via Singapore.
Cool.
And just because the firewall makes requesting stuff from the registry so slow. But this was just a matter of a error callback being called more than once. And so the first time it would call it, everything would be fine. It would call it a second time. And so the two, that should never happen. It was terrible. So they're stepping on each other, but tracking this down, it was just like there was a side comment in chat where somebody was like, I wonder if this is being caused by something like this. I'm like, all right, I think that's enough. I can go dig in. It was really hard because we didn't have any way to reproduce it until we saw that it was on it was really noticing that they were always failing once, and that was the retry that was giving us a SHA-SUM error. And once we had that, then we could actually track the damn thing down. The actual patch is like, a couple of lines. Right. But streams inevitably are the source of the things that I find of the errors that I've found trickiest and most interesting to solve.
Right. So we've talked about how you got started programming and how you got into JavaScript, and we've talked a bit about NPM. I'm curious, are there other things that you contribute to outside of NPM?
I have a bunch of like modules that I do when I'm working on my own things. I don't contribute to like any other major public open source projects. But I have a ton of modules on npm.js.
Oh, cool. We'll have to put a link to that.
Yeah. I'll have a shout out to one of them. So
is one of them your favorite?
Well, most recently I've been working on an RTF parser. An RTF to HTML converter. Interestingly, there are some that are already on the registry, but like the one I had been using, I ran into a problem with it. I'm like, oh, that's fine. I'll go patch it. And I go into it, and it's bundling a binary and then is running the binary.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, oh, God.
Nice.
So an RTF, it turns out, is... any implementation is going to be incomplete because it's essentially to write it to a complete version of RTF, you have to fully simulate Microsoft Word in memory.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah, that's all. It's real easy. It's basically a bunch of editor commands. It's a string of editor commands that you issue to Microsoft Word, and then that gives you a document when it's done.
Oh, wow.
So like there are commands that take arguments that where the argument is the code from the Windows header file.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, really, Microsoft? You put that into a spec that you published? Aren't you embarrassed? But this was, the 90s, so no, they were not embarrassed at all.
Nice.
Nowadays, maybe. The new Microsoft.
Yeah. I've been spending a lot of time with the new Microsoft these days.
Yeah.
All right, well...
They're doing some good stuff.
Yeah, they are. They're doing some really interesting stuff. They keep inviting us, the JavaScript Jabber bunch, they keep inviting us out to their conferences, so we get to go, we get to talk to cool people, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right, well, the last part of the show... Are you trying to figure out how to stay current with Ruby and Rails? I'm putting on a 2-day online conference called Ruby Remote Conf. You could check it out at rubyremoteconf.com. Like I said, it's a 2-day conference where you can come and listen to speakers and experts from all around the world talk to you about issues pertaining to Ruby and web development. We have an online Slack channel, a roundtable discussion on Zoom, and all of the talks are given over Google Hangouts, and all of the talks will be streamed to you live. Come check us out at rubyremoteconf.com. We get to go, we get to talk to cool people, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right, well, the last part of the show, and I kind of need to get there because I have another call here in about 10 minutes, is the picks. So you've been on the show, you know what picks are. But just to remind our listeners, picks are essentially stuff that you want to shout out about. It could be code-related or not code-related. So yeah, just whatever's kind of making your life happy these days. What do you have for us?
So the first one was that RTF to HTML library that I've written. I'm pretty happy with where it's ended up. We'll include a link in the show notes, I'm sure.
Yep.
Rather than trying to read that out. It's a namespace, so it's at yarna/RTF to HTML.
Mm-hmm.
Next one would be, so I had a recent Twitter discussion came out with some of the more obscure and depressing parts of American history, and that they aren't super widely known. And so I was like, people need to read about this stuff. So my other two are A People's History of the United States, which is a classic, revisiting of American history by Howard Zinn. That instead of talking about the history of the United States as a government, it talks about the history of the United States as a people and where we're everyday people throughout the history of the U.S. And the other related book is Lies My Teachers Told Me. Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong. So, and that's exactly what it says on the in the title.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of picks myself. The first one is, this is something I've had for a while, but I really, really enjoy using it, and that's my iPad Pro. So I'm going to put a link in for that. I also like the Apple Pencil that doesn't come with it. You have to buy it, but it's really nice. And then the keyboard cover that comes with it. When I'm on an airplane, I found that my laptop, which is a 15-inch MacBook Pro, is just a little bit too big to set on the seat back tray. But my iPad is just the right size. And so when I'm traveling, it's nice to have. It also has terrific speakers on it. So yeah, when I'm in a hotel room or something, I just let it blast out whatever I'm watching, and it's terrific. So I'm going to shout out about all of those things, and I'll put links to those in the show notes as well. Rebecca, if people want to follow you on Twitter or see what you're up to, what are the best places to do that?
So on Twitter, I'm Rebecca ORG. And that's the best place to follow me.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show and talking to us. It's kind of fun to see the inner workings of both you and NPM. So
it was great talking to you.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. And I think we're talking to Valery Karpov next week or on the next episode. So keep an eye out for that.
All right. Thank you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.